here we go. I told you to consider Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 9. And this passage is a pivotal turning point in the biblical narrative. It's a clear break from what is called the primordial history. That's Genesis chapters 1 through 11. At the end of chapter 11, there is a brief genealogy that builds up to this story, names the father of Abram and his grandfather and great-grandfather and some of his relatives. But as soon as we hit chapter 12, we're on a journey that would take us all the way to chapter 25, including the lives of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, right up to the life of Joseph. And the story of Abraham is a foundational story in Judaism and Christianity, and Islam for that matter. It contains many overarching meta-narratives. As I had said previously, a meta-narrative is one of those grand overarching stories that we find such resonance with as it connects to our own. It's a story that's an archetypal story. It seems to repeat itself again and again and again through the lives of others or through the narratives of other stories. It tells the story of Abram or Abraham, tells of a journey of faith through challenges, hardships, and great uncertainty. It tells of a promise made, one that never quite panned out as the reader might initially expect. Freinlein writes in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, Abraham starts from a homeland, becomes a sojourner and resident alien, and looks toward a new land for the future. Yet, though he knows the identity and size of the land and procures a down payment, he lives and dies only with the promise. But again, living with the promise as promise profoundly shapes his life and thought. The promise constantly generates new possibilities for living short of fulfillment. The promise of land functions much like this in the book of Hebrews. Those who, like Abraham, journey in faith do not finally need an enduring city. So you'll see throughout the life of Abraham and those that follow this theme of wandering and wandering and wandering and never really quite arriving. So let's turn to the text and consider verse 1 of chapter 12. Now, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Notice the use of Lord, which by now you probably have come to see that when you see Lord or Lord God, the English word Lord, it is usually the English rendering of Yahweh. So this is Yahwist material. This comes from the Yahwist material, like Genesis chapters 2 and 3, and other stories where it is clearly Lord God as opposed to Elohim. So the Abraham story consists of Yahwist, priestly, and Elohist text, and we'll notice some of those differences as we go through, but not today. But mostly Yahwist. That's the lion's share of the story of Abraham. Now notice that Abram is not told where he will go. The land will be shown at some future time. This requires Abram to leave his home and everything familiar. In so doing, he throws his complete trust behind the one who calls him from the familiar, a huge leap of faith. Christine Hayes writes, so Abram is commanded to go forth from his home and his family to a location to be named later, a location that remains for now unspecified. And this is a fact that has caused commentators for centuries to praise Abram for his faith. That is a virtue. Faith is a virtue that is connected or associated with Abram in other biblical contexts, and also in later religious traditions. He is seen as the paradigmatic exemplar of a man of faith. One last note. I'm quoting Hebert from the Common English Bible Commentary. The land and family that Abram leaves will continue to play an important role in Genesis. Abram's relatives in Haran, Genesis chapter 11, verse 31, provide wives for Isaac and Jacob. They will also shelter Jacob from Esau's anger. So apparently, you never quite leave your past behind. This place where Abram begins his journey is the place where his son and grandson go back not only to find wives, but sometimes, as in the case of Jacob, to find respite from the anger of their brother. Verse 2, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So first, great nation. Contrast this with what we just learned, if you read what led up to this in Genesis chapter 11, what we just learned about Sarai at the end of chapter 11, that she was barren, unable to have children. Crittenden writes, there was one problem about God's promise of progeny, that is, children, to bless the entire world through a single individual who in obedience journeyed into the unknown. Abraham and his wife Sarah were both about 75 years old. They didn't have our knowledge of the human biology of reproduction, but they knew that they were beyond their childbearing years. Humanly speaking, they faced an impossibility that brought them face to face with their own powerlessness to alter their circumstances. Biologically speaking, barren Sarah and impotent Abraham were, quote unquote, as good as dead. At first, both Abraham and Sarah scoffed at the idea that she would bear a child and become the mother of nations. And we'll come to that story in the coming weeks. Richard Lowry writes something that I think is also important to understand the magnitude of this promise or this blessing that God is bestowing on Abram. Lowry writes, because there is no notion of an afterlife in Genesis, and the people were thought to live on through their children, the promise of numerous descendants is, in effect, a promise of immortality. So you live on through your children, and that is how your name is remembered, which is another reason why these genealogies we keep running into are so important and why they were kept in the sacred scripture. I would like to call your attention to the back half of verse 2, where it says that Abram is made great. His name will be made great, and he will be made a great nation, so that you will be a blessing. How this contrasts with our modern mindset. The purpose for Abram's blessing was so that he would be a blessing to others. All too often, we choose to bless others out of our own abundance as an afterthought. If we have the time or an excess of resources, Sarai and Abram were chosen not for special privilege, but for witness. God chose them as conduits of the knowledge of blessing to the wider human community, writes Ron Allen and Clark Williamson. One last thing on curses. You may notice in the text as I typed it out, I typed beside it the Hebrew word for curses, both translated as curse in the English, but two different words, kolal and arar. And the first word for curse, kolal, it has a reference to any form of mistreatment. So this is saying if anyone mistreats you, and then second, the consequence, arar, which is the opposite of blessing that's being talked about as it relates to Abram. In other words, they will reap the consequences for such behaviors, which when we see people push against the ways that lead to blessing, we see the consequences reaped again and again in cyclical fashion. That could be seen as much of the story of humanity. Verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran. And they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. Few points to make. First, why bring Lot? It could be that it was because he was an orphan, which we read about in the previous chapter in verse 28. His father, Haran, has died. Or another possibility is that maybe he was dragged along as a possible answer to God's promise for offspring. Maybe he can see his nephew as his heir and progenitor. Freinlein writes, how these promises are related to Sarai's infertility sets up a key issue, though the promises at this point do not necessarily involve Sarah in the fulfillment. Lot possibly came to mind for Abram. This is pure speculation, but so much is open-ended in what God says that the point seems to be the absence of calculation on Abram's part and a simple trust in God to find a way. So you have on one hand a possibility that maybe Lot's being brought along as to be seen as his heir. This is not unlike Abram or Abraham, as you'll find in the next story about him. He tries to move things around and make things happen when he travels to Egypt in a way that's advantageous to him or protective of him. Or later he has a child by by his servant Hagar. And so there's times where Abraham tries to get things rolling when he thinks that the impossible is not being pulled off. But we don't know. In either case, Abram went, and he left the familiar in his old age, along with his family, slaves, and livestock. End of verse 5 and verse 6. They went, when they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the Oak of Mora. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. During my research, I discovered one of the more interesting things that I read. It was a travel article from the New York Times published in 1983. It chronicled the journey of the author who retraced the steps of Abraham's journey. It was called The Footsteps of Abraham. If you just Google New York Times, The Footsteps of Abraham, or Footsteps of Abraham, you should be able to find it. And it really gave some perspective as to the scope of the journey. This story today picks up in Haran, but before Abraham had arrived in Haran, he had traveled with his father from his original homeland, Ur, and had traveled from Ur up to Haran, and then from Haran to Canaan. And if you measure out the distances, from Ur to Haran, it's a distance of 600 miles. And then from Haran to Shechem, it's 400 miles. So we're not talking a little stroll down the street or a small journey. This is a 1,000-mile trek through sometimes difficult terrain. Also, the Oak of Mora, as mentioned here, was significant in its day. Mora is a Hebrew term meaning teaching or instructing. This term indicates that the Oak of Mora literally is an oak that teaches and is one where divine messages are received. Aspects of the natural landscape are viewed as sacred, and God communicates through them. And we will see this again and again as we proceed through the Torah, where certain places, like certain mountaintops, or certain places like where the burning bush was, where Moses met with God, take on a very important meaning. And this is one of those places that was already important and would continue to be so. And here's one of those times where that divine place brings a divine appearance, or that's where the divine chooses to meet with humanity. We read, "Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your offspring I will give this land.' So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel," which means house of God, "and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages toward the Negev, or the Negev desert." So this is the first of many altars that will be built, not only by Abram, but by his descendants as well. These places will be revisited again and again throughout the biblical narratives. We'll find ourselves back at Shechem. We'll find ourselves back at Bethel in different times, and that ties the narrative into the lives of future generations to come, or when they find themselves in these old places next to piles of stones that their ancestors put there, they will see themselves reflected in the lives of their ancestors. Bratcher writes, "Shechem and Bethel were both places that later became significant in the northern tribes' worship of God, as is evidenced in Joshua 24, Genesis 35, Samuel 7, 1 Samuel 7. They were originally centers of Baal worship among the Canaanites that the Israelites took over and later adapted to Yahweh worship before they built the temple in Jerusalem. While northern kings would later corrupt both sites, in the early days of Israel's history, they were important religious and social centers." As for the altar, Hebert writes, "It initiates the worship of God there that was continued by the Israelites, Abram's descendants." So not only is Abram seen as the father of the faith, but the father of proper and rightful order to worship in building this first altar. The stones left behind are returned again and again by Abram's ancestors. They become important landmarks, are built and rebuilt again for worship of Yahweh. These altars are built north to south in the area that would later comprise Israel and Judah. So as we see him progress through these geographical spaces, he builds an altar, seems like at every stop. So here is a picture of Shechem today. It has had a fortress and a small town built around what had used to be a shrine built on the spot where it was believed that Abram had built this altar. And here you have some of the ruins near Bethel, which is still a city, town in Israel, Palestine to this very day. So key takeaways, and then we'll bring it in for discussion. Today's passage marks a key turning point in the narrative. Just chapters earlier, we read about how God made a covenant with one man, Noah. Now, God covenants with Abram, but the blessings to be bestowed are not for him alone, as was the case with Noah, him and his family, but for all humanity. As was said earlier, Abram was merely a conduit. We too, you and me, are blessed so that we might be a blessing to others. We also should be conduits of blessing. Abram's journey out of the familiar and into the unfamiliar is an archetypal story. People of faith would do well to realize this. We ourselves are called out into uncertain times and sometimes risky places. These sojourns call us to a deeper reliance on God, other people, and God's creation from which we sprang. It is a mistake to think that each step in life must necessarily follow risk analysis and careful calculation. Apparently, we are meant to journey into the unknown. In the unknown, we grow and discover more than we find in the familiar. 3, Abram is responding to a call that is met with various promises. God's promises link the stories of Israel's ancestors together. They provide a goal toward which these stories point. Their aim is not shown the people of Israel to whom these stories were told, that their identity and lives hadn't come into being haphazardly, but were God's purpose for them from the beginning. Their nation, their land, their population, their blessings of wealth and well-being, their relations with their neighbors, these were all part of God's design. Much later, at the time of the priestly writer, when Israel and Judah had been conquered, these promises were no longer a reality. Yet these old promises give a vision about God's people, who God's people might be again in the future. Readers hoped they might once again see these promises come true, writes Hebert in the Common English Bible commentary. It is always this way. God's people are driven by a vision for a future that is better than our current circumstance. God promises to lead us along the way of blessing in life. We walk with God along the way and often falter, but on the journey we taste the good things that may one day find fruition. Life is still very much this way. And as I was reflecting on this earlier, I was called to mind the speech made by Martin Luther King Jr. when he described seeing the mountaintop and an acknowledgement that he may not get there, but having caught a glimpse of it, and that was a taste of it. And that was a blessing in and of itself. And he was pulling from the scriptures when he said that. Of course, he was a preacher and he was preaching then, and he was describing how Moses, in a similar way, would just see into the promised land from a distance before he died, and that was a blessing. So the promise, not quite fulfilled, drives us and leads us to surprises and creativity, and in and of itself, the drive of the promise becomes a blessing. Which leads me to my final points. Abram, later Abraham, would come to be seen as the father of the great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. His story has resonated through time, and this is no accident. We are meant to find ourselves in this grand narrative of journeying, trial and error, major fallbacks, great shortcomings, redemption, uncertainty, confusion, trust, reliance, and ultimately shalom, which is God's peace. We are each in our own way called from the comfortable in pursuit of a promise. This dance between humanity and God calls new possibilities into existence. Abram writes the narrative in response to God's direction. New babies are born, new nations are birthed, new disasters give rise to new wisdom and life on the other side. This story is but an outline of our own. And 5, lastly, we have found ourselves unable to find life, like Abraham in his old age and Sarai, barren though she was. But life often finds us in surprising and unexpected ways against all odds. By God's grace, life finds a way. And we will see that play again and again in the stories that are to follow. So I'm going to ask a few questions and then bring us back and ask you all to unmute. And the questions are these. In what ways have you been called out into the unknown? What did you discover there? What would you have missed if you had stayed where you were? I asked you all to unmute if you like. Any questions, or perhaps you'd like to respond to the last questions that I left you with?
I think every day we're called out to the unknown. I mean, when we get up in the morning, we have no idea what we're going to be facing that day. And, just to start the morning with a prayer that, God will be walking with us and walking through whatever we are doing.
Yeah. Does anyone else read the Center for Action and Contemplation meditations, daily meditations? Besides me?
Most every day. Yeah,
because the theme this week, well, the 3 weeks in a row, he's doing order, disorder, and reorder. And so last week was order. And it kind of goes along with the psychological development of, developing an ego, have a place where we can call this life. And then this week is disorder, sort of dissolving, having the reality that you've known or built kind of come crashing down around you, so that a new order can be built, so that your assumptions, your structures, maybe the reality that you think is true can kind of go away and make room for something bigger and better. And definitely I've had times where, I had a pretty sweet childhood, really. I mean, everybody has angst and, you rail against your parents or whatever. But, I was pretty protected, and I'd say things were well structured, and I had people around me making sure it was very nice. And there were disappointments, don't get me wrong, but there came a point in my life where I had progressed and was going along a path of in medicine where, I was not really breathing. I mean, I was stuck, and it was a high achievement path. And I really had to make a decision whether I was going to get out or not. And it was a really big leap to say, I'm not going to do this anymore. And boy, that was like a real uncertain. It was very, nobody understood that. It was, it created a lot of fear and anxiety in a lot of people, and including myself, because I had no idea what I was going to do. And led to a lot of experiences and places I never would have gone, and I think kind of set me on a path that was really, really very different. But I kind of lost my point. But yeah, I think I was answering your question.
You did.
Okay. So yeah, it was a real time of disorder and reorder. I still think I'm going through disorder and reorder. I still think I'm like uncertain and still like looking to where the future and the new land that's unspecified. I still think that's going on in my life. Yeah. So
if the faith journey is a mirror to the faith journeys of the people of Israel, then most of the time is spent in the wilderness. That's actually the norm rather than the exception. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the and the reassurance is God finds you in the desert and sustains you, and you look back on a journey that seemed impossible from the onset and find how God's providence had met you in profound and important ways along the way. And one of the things I think that has sold our faith short here in North America is we seem to be wanting to sell security, and not only security, but a very measured approach to life, where all of this nonsense about wandering in the desert, all of our answers are the antidote to that. And so we fear not only the unknown, but challenge. And some theologies even suggest that challenge and fear are a show of poor faith. rather than being the place where the faith meets you. And I see evidence for that as the church, you said, to talk about dismantling and then putting back together. A lot of the Israelites' journey, as we'll find, was a dismantling of old ideas, confusion, and then new mysteries about God and God's purposes discovered as things would progress. And here, as the church is experiencing in North America, probably, well, definitely in many other countries, these great societal shifts, and it's hard to see it looking the same going forward. Not only as it relates to the pandemic, that's just the newest, like the cherry on top, but it was already sort of unraveling, and churches were closing down and then consolidating in these mega churches, sort of built in the patterns of American consumerism. And so because we've been so afraid of the dismantling, the disorientation, we haven't allowed these spaces, these times, to help us grow. We've clung to it. We've clung to the order we thought we had, and we miss out on what I believe is coming. And I say that as a person of faith, always leaving the lands that we've come to know into the great unknown, not knowing what will meet us there. But if Abram's story is an archetypal story, it's our story too. And this means that we will discover on the way what it means to walk with God through the wilderness, and it will be fine. I'm preaching. I'm sorry.
Well, no, but it's true. You're right. I mean, every day we have a new challenge, right? You know, every day you wake up and it's unknown, like what's gonna be waiting for us. So,
I think the challenge for us this day for Christianity is that we are no longer the religion.
Right.
We are now challenged if we want to stand up and say we won't do something because we don't believe in that. We can be sued for that. We're no longer allowed to express what we think God is trying to tell us. And if you look around the world, you will see that there are people. I think last week there were 33 people killed in one of the African countries because they believe in Jesus. It's almost like the church has become Israel, and we're having all kinds of trials and tribulations within the church itself. And I think that's why we try to hang on to what we had, because it seems to be slipping away from us.
I think a lot of what we thought we had, these institutions signified by these large buildings. And I look at all the other parallels in other institutions that aren't church. You could pick the Shriners building downtown, or the Scottish Rites Cathedral, or any of these big structures that in the beginning of the 20th century were erected. And those institutions were very important and significant to those who built them, including the churches. At the same time as those buildings were going up, large church buildings were going up across America. And as those buildings and those structures grow old and weary and tired and become less sustainable, we feel like the church is dying. But those were never the church. Those were sometimes the church, sometimes social clubs, sometimes important, significant communities that held people close. But the church are the people that God calls together by way of God's Spirit towards the life-giving way that Jesus shows us as Jesus the Christ. And it began with no big buildings, and it exists in spite of no big buildings. And we see it even living in moments like these as we try to grapple with a life lived long ago and its implications on our own, and what the stories like today's story call from us.
Well, I look at this story. I mean, I guess there's
the part that is historically, leads into, establishment of, the Abraham's legacy or descendants and so on in that whole biblical narrative. But also there's that part about where he was just called to go somewhere and he didn't know where he was going to go, but he, through faith, said, okay, he would do it. And I think we have those kind of calls in life all the time, and you can stay where it's comfortable and say no, or you can accept that call. And I think when you do accept that call, even though it's hard, then it can bring so many rewards and meaning to your life and relationships and ways to touch other people's lives. And so I think if that's his example, then, certainly I think we are called to do things all the time, sometimes just opportunities that present themselves. And if you pick those up, then often your life is fuller. And so that's how the story spoke to me just now.
I'm a little late getting in here, but I feel the same way. If you step out in faith, that's the only way you're really going to grow. You just kind of stay put. The easy way is saying no all the time. You really don't grow.
Right.
Okay, I'll jump in here with sitting here in the lap of luxury looks like if you we're sitting here, we're not sure how soon our future will come together back in Indiana. We're sitting here with who's got it worse with COVID-19, Santa Clara here in California, or Marion County in Indiana. And then having added, we're sort of surrounded with 2 to 3 forest fires going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
So we're staying inside, obviously. Air conditioning is doing a good job of filtering the air so far. So what's happening tomorrow? Well,
Yeah.
come on faith, guys.
Well, I'm in the process of putting together the presentation. I'll be finishing it tomorrow that I'm going to send out about our opening. And so much of it is outside of our control. And we can react to that in 2 ways. We can panic and feel like we're going to drown, or we can stay the course and trust in God. And it sounds so simple, but it's so difficult to live out in real time. That's why I brought in that bit about Lot into this story. Now later, it's very clear that Abraham is trying to push things in the direction he thinks they need to be going. This was like a maybe, that's why he brought Lot sort of thing. But you certainly see that in churches and in households when you feel sort of aimless and there's so much out of your control. And so you just try to force it quickly to contort your life circumstance into the way that you wish that it was. And when you do that, you usually end up spending more energy doing what you can really not do in the end to find your situation resolve around you in its own time. And that's part of the journey of faith when you're trying to learn how to. Riptides is a great metaphor for this. Riptides in the ocean pull you out away from the ocean, out into the ocean. And most people who drown in riptides waste their energy fighting the riptide that they cannot beat. But what they don't know is most times, if you just let the tide take you, it comes back around to the shore. And so if you can ride it out and stay afloat and I guess keep the faith, you will find yourself in the place where you wanted, regardless. And I think life has many times like that, where I know for myself, I could spend days and hours of days, or weeks even, fighting forces, trying to get my life in the place I want it to be, when so much is outside of my control. And this virus right now is an excellent example of that. So many people try. I'm not going to let. I hear a lot. I'm not going to live in fear. I'm not actually living in fear, to be honest with you. But what they usually mean by that is I'm not going to keep my circumstance from me just taking action. Actions don't make much sense to make with the schools opening, or whatever it is you're saying, and then it bites you in the end, as opposed to let the thing take its course and see. And when you get to the other side, you learn how much of it you needed to give up to God and to others to carry. Preaching again, but Abraham's life story is one of the stories for a reason.
And what is the reason?
Because it echoes and repeats in different new ways. Each of us identified. I could name several times in my life where I felt like I was leaving into the unknown when I could have stayed, and then thought I knew what to expect there, and was surprised and had to constantly recalibrate and readjust. My call to Northwood has been that way. I knew I had to leave, and then I found the place. The Northwood. I knew it was Northwood, and I thought I was going to arrive and everything would just become immediately clear, and then the church would build around me, and then we would all be very happy. And then I got here, and there's still so much I don't know about our future. But
I just know things about the future.
right, and so I'm trying to keep myself grounded in the reality, but also hopeful that the journey leads us to a place that is worthwhile. So my metric for success in life is wrestling with this idea. I don't want to throw out plan making. I won't do that. I'm not talking about just church now. I'm talking about life in general now. I don't want to throw out trying to do as much as I can with what I've got. I think that is also a biblical idea. I know that is. So this balance between reliance but also walking when you can is I think a lot of life's struggle. And then again, Abraham as an archetypal story, we see ourselves in this struggle. So I
think the story is just visible over and over again. They're going places, and they have faith in God, and they get where they're supposed to be. That, to me, that's, look at David. He was made king, but he couldn't be king. He had to just keep on going and going. And eventually he became king. And Paul, who would have thought he was going around killing the Jews, and he ends up going out to save the Gentiles. It's with faith, always with faith. And with the faith, you complete your journey.
Paul died in prison. Was his life a success?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
He left his words. If we didn't have his words, there would be a lot of things we wouldn't know. Mm-hmm. He told us a lot of things that we needed to know, and he encourages us.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. I guess another part is that you really don't know. Your life only goes so far. You don't know what's going to happen after because of, accepting some call. I mean, like Paul died in prison, but how could he know what his influence was later, centuries later?
Right.
But Paul knew he was doing what the Lord wanted him to do, and he did it.
If no one had picked up his letters and no one had copied them down, he still would have done it, I think.
Yeah.
That's right. Most of us.
Yeah.
But talk about a turnaround from where he'd come from to what he became. It's amazing.
It is truly.
Hmm.
Yeah. Or you think about some of the other saints who just lived in obscurity, and if somebody hadn't followed them and spread their word, I mean, Saints Francis and Clare, or people who had no public face and were so humble and strange, and we know about them today just because people loved them and cared about them and what they had to say. It is truly amazing sometimes how their words and deeds got carried forward through time, and that they didn't expect that. They just did what they were called to do.
Those, it'll be coming up in this next sermon on Sunday that I just was working on and recording. Those who lose their life find it. It's like, I don't know, in a culture that fetishizes fame, we're made sad when somebody, they became famous posthumously. How tragic. That's just terrible, because the goal in the mind of, and I feel this myself, I'm trying to untangle this out of my heart because it's embedded in me. But the goal is to do it for its own sake, because it's right. And if people notice later, then that's wonderful. But if you're fixated on getting your words written down, that's one of the great things. Jesus, no one wrote his words down until after he died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And St. Francis didn't write any of his words down. All of his sayings and things that we know came from things his friends said. I think the Canticle of Brother, Sun, and Sister Moon, he wrote things like that, but much about his life is just passed on through storytelling.
Yeah.
And here we are talking about Abraham.
Yeah.
See what he started?
But it is hard. I mean, it is disorienting, and it is difficult, to answer a call, or to say, I can't do that anymore, or I'm going to go this way instead of the way that's expected, or the way I used to go, or I don't know how that's going to go, or it's hard. I mean, it's there's a lot to give up, and I guess it is good to have these meta narratives where other people tried and failed and made out okay or didn't, or it's written down somewhere and you can see what that experiment looked like.
Helps us make meaning of our own stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Find the words and the ways of seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're going to have many more good discussions like this. One thing I've learned is if I can keep the teaching part short, then we can have more room for discussion, which I think I should focus on. And so I'll try to make that a priority. Between now and next week, read the rest of chapter 12. We've got a kind of an interesting story where you'll have to have some questions about Abram's decision making. And then read 13 and read, go ahead and read through the end of 14, although we're not going to get there, but just so you kind of have if you've got time. And
so the rest of 12 and 13 and 14, if we have time.
yes.
Just so I understand.
All right. And I'm going to close it out now. Nancy, do you have time for a phone conversation if I called you as soon as I hang up?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to do that.
Okay, great.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, we'll
Bye-bye.
see you.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
California.